Before we dive into this story, make sure to comment, like, and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Let me know what you think below. Your feedback keeps us going. The streets of Brooklyn were always bustling, filled with a sense of urgency that could be felt in the air. It wasn't the kind of place where you stood still, where time seemed to wait for anyone. Paul Castellano had grown up in the heart of it, watching the world move fast and sometimes recklessly, as people scurried through life, each with their own agenda. But Paul wasn't like everyone else. He didn't rush, didn't react impulsively to the chaotic world around him. From a young age, he had learned the value of waiting, of letting things unfold at their own pace, all the while keeping his eyes open, watching, calculating. The Castellano family was a staple in Brooklyn, running a small but respected butcher shop. It was more than just a place to buy meat. It was where deals were made, debts were settled, and loyalty was cemented. Paul's father, Yeppy, had always said that a business wasn't just about the goods, it was about the relationships you built. Paul had absorbed those lessons early on. While the other boys played in the streets, distracted by the noise and the thrill of the moment, Paul spent his time observing. He watched his father, who never seemed hurried, always in control, always precise with each cut of meat, each interaction with the regulars. Paul understood that the quiet moments mattered just as much as the loud ones. It was in the small details, the unspoken gestures, that true power lay. Paul knew from a young age that this world, the one his family was part of, ran on more than just money. It ran on trust, respect, and, most importantly, silence. People didn't need to say much for Paul to understand what they meant. He learned early how to read people, how to listen to what they weren't saying. His father didn't need to raise his voice to get respect, it was his presence that commanded it. And Paul had inherited that, though in his own way. While the other boys grew up dreaming of quick riches, Paul saw something different. He saw the long game, the one that involved careful moves, patience, and above all, control. By the time he was in his late teens, Paul had moved beyond just working in the butcher shop. He had started making deliveries, running small errands around the neighborhood, and meeting people in the business world. He began to see the bigger picture. The men who controlled the docks, the truckers, the union leaders, these were the men who truly shaped the city. They didn't show off their power. They didn't need to. They made things happen from behind the scenes, moving quietly, never drawing attention to themselves. And that's what Paul aimed for. He didn't need to be seen, he needed to be felt. He needed to build a web of influence that stretched across Brooklyn, that would make him indispensable to everyone around him. He wasn't in a rush. He knew that patience would get him where he wanted to go. At home, his mother, Keta, maintained the same strict discipline. The house was always in order, meals were on time, and there were no exceptions to the rules. Paul admired her for that. In a world where so much seemed chaotic, she created an island of stability. He learned from her that control didn't just come from the outside, it came from within. It was about being able to keep your own house in order before you could manage anything else. While Paul's peers were interested in flashy displays of power, Paul kept his focus on the long term. He started to connect the dots, building a network of people who owed him favors, people who would eventually make him indispensable. He didn't care for the fleeting moments of attention. What mattered to him was the foundation, the relationships that would last, the influence that would grow quietly over time. He knew that true power wasn't in being loud or aggressive, it was in being steady, reliable, and always a step ahead. But the world around him was beginning to change. The younger generation, the ones who had grown up in a time of street violence and showmanship, were beginning to challenge the old ways. They wanted more than steady income from legitimate businesses, they wanted fast money, fast power. And they weren't interested in waiting for it. They looked at Paul and saw an old man stuck in his ways, someone who didn't understand the speed of the world they were now living in. To them, Paul's approach seemed slow, almost timid. They wanted action. Paul didn't see it that way. To him, control didn't come from taking risks, it came from knowing when to act and when to wait. But the world was changing. Fast. And the people around him were changing with it. The respect Paul had built over the years wasn't enough to shield him from the inevitable shifts happening in his world. But Paul knew something the younger generation didn't. Power wasn't just about action. It was about understanding the rhythms of the world, knowing when to be loud and when to remain silent. It was about building something that would last, even if the world around you was speeding up. Paul wasn't going to chase after trends or try to match the noise. He was going to keep his focus on the long game. But the time for silence was quickly coming to an end. The city was changing, and so was Paul's role within it. As Paul grew older, the world around him seemed to speed up. The bustling streets of Brooklyn were alive with noise, new businesses sprouted, people came and went, and the pulse of the city quickened. But for Paul, the rules had never changed. He knew that the key to lasting success was not chasing the trends or trying to compete with the noise. It was about staying focused, being disciplined, and quietly controlling the flow of things. Yet, even as he clung to his old methods, Paul couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the world he had spent years building. The younger generation wasn't interested in waiting. They wanted their power fast, and they were growing restless. Paul had always worked behind the scenes, building his network, securing his position without fanfare. He made deals with the men who controlled the docks, the unions, the businesses. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. He operated from the shadows, where the real power lay. But now, the young men in his family were starting to look elsewhere. They weren't impressed by the quiet way Paul did things. They wanted to see results now. They wanted to see action. The streets were full of noise and energy, and they wanted to be part of it. John Gotti was one of them, the embodiment of everything Paul had avoided. Gotti was loud, brash, and willing to do anything to get ahead. He made waves wherever he went, drawing attention to himself, showing off his strength and power. To the younger men in the family, he was a symbol of the future, someone who was ready to take what they wanted without hesitation. Paul, in contrast, represented the old ways, the slow, steady approach, the careful calculation, the long-term vision. And as much as Paul respected the loyalty of the men around him, he knew the younger generation was growing impatient. They weren't interested in playing the long game. They wanted quick results. And Gotti, with his growing influence, was offering just that. The first signs of change came subtly. A few of the younger captains started to question Paul's decisions. They wanted more than steady profits from legitimate businesses. They wanted the excitement of the streets. They didn't understand why Paul wasn't embracing the chaos, the hustle that had defined the earlier days of the Mafia. They were eager to take risks, eager to make a name for themselves. And Gotti, with his ability to make things happen quickly, became their leader. The respect Paul had once commanded started to slip away, replaced by a growing admiration for Gotti's boldness. As Paul watched the shift unfold, he began to understand something he hadn't fully grasped before. The world was changing. The young men in the family wanted the spotlight, and they didn't want to wait for it. They wanted control over the city, over the streets, and they were willing to risk everything to get it. The old ways of quiet power, of moving strategically and without drawing attention, no longer seemed to have the same appeal. Paul's steady hand, which had kept the family thriving for so many years, was starting to be seen as outdated, even weak. But Paul wasn't one to give up easily. He knew that the family's strength lay in its ability to control industries, construction, trucking, unions, and the meat trade. These weren't just businesses. They were the lifeblood of New York City, and Paul had his hands in all of them. He knew how to make the right deals, how to keep things running smoothly without anyone noticing. And he wasn't about to let that go. But the younger generation wasn't interested in those steady, behind-the-scenes moves. They wanted visible action, quick profits, and the thrill of the street-level hustle. One evening, Paul found himself alone in his office, staring out at the city below. The lights of Brooklyn flickered in the distance, and the sound of the streets seemed to reach him even from this high up. For a moment, he let himself reflect on how far he had come. He had built an empire from nothing, moved carefully and deliberately, and risen to the top without ever drawing attention to himself. But now, as he looked out over the city, he felt something shift deep inside him. The world was changing, and Paul knew he had to change with it. But could he? He thought of Gotti and the younger soldiers who had turned their loyalty toward him. They didn't understand what Paul had built. They saw it as old-fashioned, slow, and, worst of all, irrelevant. They wanted to live in the moment, to take control without hesitation. And as much as Paul hated to admit it, he knew they had a point. The world was different now. The streets were more unpredictable, and the old ways of operating didn't seem to fit anymore. But even as he grappled with these thoughts, Paul knew one thing: he wasn't ready to give up. He had spent too many years building his empire, too many years carefully constructing a network of influence that stretched across the city. He wasn't about to let that go without a fight. He may not have been able to keep up with the fast-paced chaos of the younger generation, but he still had the tools, the resources, and the connections to fight back. He wasn't ready to lose control. He just needed to find a way to adapt to this new world without losing everything he had worked for. And so, as the city pulsed with energy and noise, Paul Castellano made a decision. He would no longer remain passive. He would act, but on his terms. He would find a way to hold on to what was his, no matter the cost. The game had changed, but Paul wasn't about to be left behind. The tension between Paul and Gotti continued to build in the weeks that followed, with each passing day making the divide between them more evident. Paul could no longer ignore the fact that the world he had worked so hard to create was rapidly slipping from his grasp. The younger generation, driven by a desire for immediate results, wasn't just challenging Paul's leadership, they were undermining it. The streets, which had once been his domain, now seemed to belong to Gotti and his followers. Paul had always been a patient man, and his methodical, behind-the-scenes approach had served him well for decades. But as Gotti's popularity surged, Paul's calm, quiet style began to seem out of place. The younger men in the family admired Gotti's boldness, his willingness to take risks, and his ability to rise to prominence so quickly. Paul, on the other hand, was seen as slow-moving, careful to the point of being cautious, and unwilling to take the kind of action that the younger generation wanted. To them, Paul's world was too small, too limited by the rules and methods of the past. Gotti's style was everything Paul had avoided: loud, brash, and full of drama. Where Paul believed in control and influence, Gotti believed in spectacle and power. He didn't wait for opportunities, he took them, making a name for himself in the streets with every move. And the younger men loved it. They were drawn to Gotti's charisma, his fire, his willingness to do whatever it took to seize power. In their eyes, Paul was too old, too set in his ways, too focused on the past to lead them into the future. It wasn't just about the street soldiers anymore, it was about the business too. Paul had built his empire on industries that ran the city quietly: construction, trucking, unions, and meat distribution. But Gotti's men weren't interested in running businesses in the shadows. They wanted to be seen. They wanted quick money, fast results, and the thrill of living large. They didn't care for the stability that Paul offered. They wanted action, and that's what Gotti provided. The pressure was starting to mount. Paul knew that the family's loyalty was beginning to slip, and with every passing day, he felt the foundation he had worked so hard to build starting to crack. But Paul wasn't a man who easily gave up. He had fought for everything he had, and he wasn't about to lose it now. He still had his allies, those who respected him for his vision, for his ability to keep things running smoothly, for his quiet strength. But even they were beginning to question whether the old ways were still viable. One evening, as Paul sat in his office, staring out over the Brooklyn skyline, he found himself lost in thought. The city stretched out before him, a maze of streets and buildings that he had come to know intimately over the years. It was his city, the one he had shaped, and yet, it felt like it was slipping from his control. The world was changing. And Paul, the quiet mastermind, the man who had once held all the power, was now fighting to keep his place. He thought about Gotti and the younger generation. He thought about how quickly they had risen, how easily they had won over the streets, the soldiers, and even some of the older men in the family. They didn't have the patience that Paul had, they didn't need it. They wanted immediate results, and they were getting them. It wasn't just that they had the street energy, It was that they understood how to capitalize on the chaos of the city. They were living in a world that was fast, volatile, and full of risk. And they thrived in it. Paul, on the other hand, had built his empire on stability, on making slow, steady moves that ensured long-term control. He hadn't needed to show off or take risks. He had built his power quietly, slowly, letting the world turn around him while he stayed in control. But now, that quiet approach was being questioned. Now, Gotti and the others were proving that the streets weren't interested in stability, they were interested in who could make the most noise, who could grab power the fastest. The thought gnawed at Paul. Could he adapt to this new world? Could he shift his approach without losing everything he had built? He wasn't a man who embraced change easily, but he wasn't a fool either. If he didn't adapt, if he didn't find a way to navigate this new era, everything he had worked for would crumble. Paul knew that he couldn't afford to sit back and wait any longer. It was time to act. He wasn't going to start a war with Gotti, but he couldn't let the family slip into chaos. There was still power to be had, still room for Paul to maneuver. He didn't need to be flashy. He didn't need to be loud. But he could still make moves, quiet moves that would ensure his place at the top. The decision was clear. Paul would adapt, but on his own terms. He would use the strength of his position, the quiet power he had always held, to outmaneuver Gotti and the younger generation. They wanted fast results, quick money, but Paul knew that true power came from control over time, not momentary bursts of success. And with that, Paul Castellano began to prepare for his next move. The family wasn't going to slip away from him, not without a fight. The decision to act wasn't one Paul made lightly, but it was clear that if he didn't, his empire would slip away piece by piece. The tension between him and Gotti had reached its boiling point, but Paul wasn't about to let a man like Gotti tear down everything he had built, not without a plan. Paul had always known that control wasn't about shouting the loudest or taking the most risks, it was about using the resources at your disposal and executing moves with precision. The loudest men often had the shortest reins. It was time to remind the family why they had followed Paul for so many years. He wasn't going to go to war with Gotti, at least, not in the way Gotti was expecting. Paul knew that a direct confrontation, a flashy show of force, would only play into the younger generation's hands. They craved spectacle. But Paul didn't need spectacle. He needed strategy, patience, and a subtle shift in the way things worked within the family. Paul spent the next few weeks moving behind the scenes, quietly strengthening his position. He began meeting with his most loyal allies, reaching out to those who still respected his leadership and had been hesitant to follow Gotti's brash rise. Paul knew that loyalty wasn't just about showing allegiance, it was about creating a network of relationships that couldn't be easily undone. He made sure that his allies in the unions, in construction, and in the various industries his family controlled remained loyal. It wasn't just about ensuring that businesses stayed profitable, it was about making sure that the power structure stayed intact. There were whispers in the family, rumors of alliances being formed in the shadows, and while some of his men began to shift toward Gotti, there were still enough who respected Paul's steady hand. It wasn't just loyalty that Paul commanded, it was respect, the kind that came from years of quietly running things in the background. He hadn't needed to make a spectacle of himself to earn it. It had been earned over time, through consistency and reliability. And as much as the younger generation wanted to move quickly and loudly, Paul knew they hadn't yet learned the most important lesson: power wasn't just about seizing the moment. It was about knowing when to strike and when to wait. The first step in his strategy was to isolate Gotti from some of the key members of the family. Gotti's appeal was in his energy, his ability to make things happen quickly, and his charisma on the streets. But Paul understood that if he could convince enough of the old guard that Gotti's quick fixes were unsustainable, he could turn the tide back in his favor. He began having quiet conversations with the captains, reminding them of the family's legacy, how they had built their power with steady hands and careful decision-making. Paul knew that Gotti's approach wasn't sustainable. The streets were full of energy now, but that energy came with a price. The showmanship and constant hustle would eventually burn out. Paul wasn't worried about competing with Gotti's flair. He was confident that in the long run, his calm, methodical approach would win out. The key was to make sure that when the time came, the family would see Gotti's rise as a temporary spark, something that would eventually burn out. Gotti was playing to the moment, while Paul was playing for the future. His slow, steady moves were his strength. And as he worked in the shadows, Paul began to realize something important. He wasn't just fighting for control over the family, he was fighting for his legacy. The family would either see him as a man who understood how to adapt and maintain power, or as someone who had been left behind by the speed of change. But Paul wasn't about to let that happen. Every move he made now was about showing his men that the future wasn't about running toward the chaos, it was about controlling the chaos. Gotti's rise was loud, but Paul's influence was deeper, quieter, and more enduring. He didn't need to be the loudest in the room, he just needed to be the most reliable, the most consistent. And as the family continued to watch, Paul's plan started to take shape. In the quiet of his office, Paul sat alone one evening, contemplating the next step. The city stretched out before him, as it always had, with its constant hum of life below. But for Paul, the world had changed. He wasn't just leading the family anymore, he was fighting to keep it from falling apart. He had fought for everything he had, and he wasn't about to let Gotti, or anyone else, take it from him. The next move would be critical. But Paul wasn't afraid of a challenge. He had always known that in order to win, he had to outlast the noise. And the noise was exactly what Gotti represented. As Paul prepared for the next phase of his plan, he knew that the family would be watching closely. They were looking for a leader who could stand tall in the face of change, who could keep the empire intact without losing control. Paul knew that if he could stay true to the principles that had served him well for so many years, patience, discretion, and control, he could weather the storm. The next few months would determine whether Paul Castellano could continue to lead the Gambino family, or if the younger generation, led by Gotti, would seize the reins. The battle for control within the Gambino family was becoming less about individual confrontations and more about the shifting undercurrents of loyalty. Paul Castellano was a man who had always thrived in the shadows, building his empire quietly, steadily. But now, in the face of Gotti's fast rise, Paul was forced to act, not just to preserve his power, but to ensure that the family's future remained intact. Paul knew that Gotti's appeal was undeniable. He had a natural charisma that drew people to him, especially the younger soldiers who were eager to leave the old ways behind and embrace a new era of fast money and visible power. Gotti didn't hesitate. He acted with confidence, flaunting his power in the streets, making it clear that he wasn't afraid to take risks. He gave people what they wanted: excitement, energy, and the promise of quick rewards. But Paul understood something Gotti didn't. The true value of control was in patience, in maintaining influence over time, and in understanding the long-term consequences of every decision. While Gotti's methods were loud and immediate, Paul's approach was slow, deliberate, and rooted in careful planning. Over the past few weeks, Paul had been working behind the scenes, strengthening his alliances with the older members of the family, those who had seen the family rise through patience and calculation. These men had a deep respect for Paul, not because he was flashy, but because he understood the value of loyalty and long-term success. Paul's strategy was clear: he didn't need to overpower Gotti immediately. What mattered was shifting the focus back to what had always made the Gambino family powerful: steady control, the ability to move quietly and make the right connections. Gotti might be able to excite the streets for a moment, but Paul knew that true power came from building a foundation that couldn't easily be toppled. The first part of Paul's plan involved working to isolate Gotti from the core of the family, those who valued stability and quiet influence. Paul didn't want to start a war with Gotti. Instead, he wanted to turn Gotti's loud rise into a weakness. The more Gotti made noise, the more the cracks in his leadership would appear. Paul didn't need to rush, he just needed time. At the same time, Paul's business ventures were running smoothly. He continued to maintain control over the construction industry, the unions, and the other legitimate and illegal operations the family had mastered. His influence, although no longer as loud as Gotti's, was felt everywhere. He had built his empire not on flashy displays of power but on the steady flow of goods, money, and connections. In the world of business, Paul was untouchable. But in the streets, he was becoming less relevant. It was in this quiet power that Paul found his strength. He didn't need to be seen. He just needed to ensure that when the time came, he could pull the right strings to make things happen. And for that, he had to maintain the loyalty of those who still believed in the family's long-term vision. One day, while Paul was meeting with one of his trusted advisors, he was reminded of something his father used to say: "The loudest man in the room is often the one who has the least to say." Paul had always taken that advice to heart. It wasn't about making noise or drawing attention. It was about staying in control, watching the landscape, and making sure that when things fell apart, you were the one still standing. As Paul sat back in his chair, contemplating his next steps, he realized that the situation was more delicate than he had first thought. His influence was still strong, but it was being slowly chipped away by Gotti's rise. Paul wasn't foolish enough to think he could ignore Gotti entirely. The younger generation had embraced him, and Paul knew that Gotti's presence couldn't be dismissed. But what Paul understood better than anyone was that in the Mafia world, change didn't happen overnight. And in the long run, the loudest, flashiest moves often led to the quickest fall. Paul's focus now was on maintaining his grip on the family. He knew that he had to keep the business running, but he also had to protect the family's legacy. The future wasn't just about the men on the streets, it was about the next generation. Paul needed to ensure that his influence remained strong, that the values of loyalty and respect that had made the family great were not lost in the rush for quick power. The next phase of his plan was to reassert his authority within the family by proving that, despite Gotti's popularity, Paul was still the one who understood how to keep the business running, how to keep the flow of money steady, and how to maintain control of the family's operations. The streets might be changing, but the family needed Paul's steady hand to keep everything from falling apart. As the days passed, Paul's sense of purpose grew stronger. He knew that this fight wasn't just about his position, it was about preserving the legacy of the family he had helped build. He wasn't going to let Gotti or anyone else take that from him. But the challenge was greater than he had ever imagined. The world had changed, and Paul needed to change with it. It was no longer enough to simply maintain control. He had to find a way to adapt to the new world without losing what had made the family great in the first place. The tension that had been building for weeks between Paul and Gotti now seemed inevitable. The younger generation, eager for their share of power, no longer saw Paul's calculated approach as relevant. They wanted the immediate satisfaction of Gotti's bold leadership, the visible victories that came with taking risks, making moves, and creating noise. But Paul's grip on the family, though tested, had not yet faltered. He knew it wasn't about playing Gotti's game. Paul needed to play his own, a game of patience, subtlety, and control. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Paul sat alone in his office, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short amount of time. The family that had once followed him out of respect for his steady hand was now divided, torn between the old way of doing things and the new wave of boldness that Gotti represented. Paul had built his empire by keeping things quiet, by ensuring the family's operations ran smoothly while staying under the radar. But now, with Gotti's growing influence, Paul found himself questioning whether that approach would be enough to maintain his control. The question weighed heavily on Paul as he sat in the dimly lit room, his mind racing with options. He knew he couldn't win by trying to outdo Gotti at his own game. Gotti thrived on chaos and excitement, something Paul had always avoided. But there was one thing Gotti didn't have: time. Paul had spent years building relationships, securing power, and influencing key sectors of the city. Gotti might have the streets, but Paul had the businesses, the unions, and the money that flowed beneath the surface. The question was how to use it to his advantage. Paul knew the key to regaining control lay in one thing: loyalty. He had always believed that loyalty was the true measure of power. It wasn't about flashy moves, it was about the people who would stand by you when times were tough. He needed to remind the family of that, to make them see that despite the noise and excitement that Gotti was offering, it was Paul who had the long-term vision. He wasn't here for a short-term flash of success, he was here to ensure the family's legacy endured. The first part of his plan was to make the family see the consequences of Gotti's rise. Gotti might have captured the streets with his bravado, but Paul understood the larger picture. He began to meet with his most trusted men, the ones who had stayed loyal to him through thick and thin. He didn't make promises or offer grand speeches. Instead, he reminded them of what the family had built together. The years of quiet, careful planning had given them an empire. Gotti might be popular now, but Paul was the one who had set the foundation for lasting power. As Paul spoke to his allies, he could see the subtle shift happening. They weren't ready to jump ship, not just yet. Paul knew they respected him, but Gotti's influence had been hard to ignore. It was up to Paul to prove that his methodical, controlled approach was still the best way forward. He needed to remind them that the family was not about excitement and speed, it was about legacy. And legacy, Paul knew, took time to build, but it could be torn down in an instant if they weren't careful. Meanwhile, Gotti continued to rise in the streets, gaining more influence and capturing the attention of the younger soldiers. His loud, bold moves were starting to seem like the only path forward for the family. But Paul wasn't concerned about Gotti's popularity. What Paul understood better than anyone else was the fact that Gotti's success was built on moments, not systems. The excitement of today wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the family would need stability again, the kind of stability that only Paul could provide. Paul wasn't going to start a war. He wasn't going to challenge Gotti directly. Instead, he would continue doing what he did best, running things from behind the scenes. He would make sure the family's legitimate businesses thrived, and he would quietly work to keep Gotti's loud actions from unraveling everything Paul had spent years building. The younger soldiers might be captivated by Gotti's quick rise, but Paul knew that their loyalty to the family, their commitment to what they had built together, was stronger than any flashy promises. The key was to outlast Gotti. Paul had seen countless young men rise and fall in the streets, their excitement and ambition burning bright for a time, only to burn out just as quickly. Gotti might be the flavor of the month, but Paul had built something that would endure. It wasn't just about the family's money, it was about the loyalty, the respect, and the connections Paul had spent decades building. Gotti may have won the hearts of the streets, but Paul still controlled the arteries that kept the family alive. As the days passed, Paul continued to strengthen his position. He made sure his businesses remained profitable, ensuring the family's resources were steady. He kept his circle tight, relying on the men who had stood by him for years. And slowly, but surely, he began to see cracks in Gotti's empire. The younger soldiers were growing restless. They wanted more than just the excitement of the streets, they wanted security. And that's where Paul came in. Paul wasn't just the quiet, methodical man he had been before. He was now a man with a renewed sense of purpose. He was ready to remind the family of why they followed him in the first place. He wasn't going to give up the family's legacy. He was going to make sure it endured, even if it meant waiting a little longer for the right moment to make his move. As Paul watched Gotti's influence continue to grow, the weight of the situation became clearer with each passing day. Gotti had the streets, the excitement, and the energy of the younger generation on his side. The noise he created reverberated through every corner of the city, drawing attention and support from those eager for quick power and fast money. But Paul understood something deeper than all that noise. He understood that the true strength of any empire wasn't built on excitement, it was built on foundation, loyalty, and longevity. And while Gotti played to the moment, Paul played for the future. The quiet strategy Paul had spent years developing was now his greatest asset. He didn't need the spotlight, he had spent too many years in its shadows, learning how to pull the strings, how to ensure that the machinery of the family ran smoothly, unseen but crucial. But the younger men, drawn to Gotti's charisma, were no longer interested in playing for the long game. They were chasing the quick, visible rewards, drawn to Gotti's method of immediate success. Paul had spent too long in the business world, too long building an empire, to let it all slip away because of some flash in the pan. He understood that nothing of value came easily or quickly. What Gotti didn't understand was that all the quick money, the flashiness, and the attention could be fleeting. The streets could be ruled by noise for a time, but what happened when that noise faded? Paul had a reputation, a network, and the resources to weather any storm. What he needed now was the loyalty of the men who still believed in him. He needed to remind them of what had made the Gambino family great in the first place, the ability to build, to grow, and to endure. The next step was crucial. Paul had to ensure that Gotti's rise wasn't the beginning of the end, but rather the moment when Gotti's influence began to show its cracks. Gotti's appeal was undeniable, but Paul was determined to prove that Gotti's style was short-sighted. And so, with calm precision, Paul began to methodically work the family's operations, solidifying his control without drawing attention to himself. His plan wasn't to confront Gotti directly. Paul knew better than to engage in a loud battle over power. Instead, he would ensure that the family's foundation was strong, that the flow of money, resources, and loyalty remained under his control. Paul spent the next few weeks making quiet but powerful moves. He strengthened relationships with key players, businessmen, union leaders, and old allies who had always respected his careful management. Paul had always believed in the long game, and this was where it would pay off. Gotti's rise might have been rapid, but it was built on excitement, not structure. It was only a matter of time before the foundations began to shake. But there were cracks in the family's unity that Paul had to address. The loyalty of the younger soldiers was wavering, and Paul knew that if he didn't act now, he risked losing them entirely. He started holding private meetings with the captains, reminding them of the importance of loyalty, the value of steady control over quick bursts of power. He talked about the future, about the legacy of the Gambino family, and how their success wasn't just about the streets, it was about the businesses they controlled, the respect they commanded in the boardrooms as well as the back alleys. Paul didn't need to compete with Gotti's public displays of strength. He needed to remind the family why they had followed him in the first place. He showed them that the quiet control he had built over years was just as powerful as the chaos Gotti thrived on. The younger generation might be drawn to the quick rush of power, but Paul's world was about something deeper, control that couldn't be easily stolen, respect that didn't need to be earned with a flashy gesture, but with consistent, reliable strength. The tide, though slow, began to turn. Some of Gotti's men, those who had been caught up in the excitement of his rise, began to question whether the rapid success was sustainable. Paul's quiet reminders of the long game, of building power that lasted, began to resonate with some of them. He wasn't offering instant rewards or public admiration, but he was offering something more valuable in the long run: stability. As Paul's influence started to grow again, he focused on consolidating his power in the shadows, where it had always been strongest. He knew that if he could maintain control over the family's businesses, if he could keep the money flowing steadily and the loyalty intact, he would outlast the noise. It wasn't about being the loudest, it was about being the most reliable. But Paul knew that this wouldn't be easy. Gotti wasn't going to step aside just because Paul had reminded a few men of the old ways. The real test would come when Gotti felt threatened enough to make a move. Paul was prepared, but he couldn't afford to underestimate the speed with which Gotti acted. The young captain's ambition was boundless, and that could be dangerous. Still, Paul's calm demeanor, his steady hand, and his deep understanding of the family's operations were his greatest strengths. As he sat in his office late one night, looking out over the city, Paul reminded himself of the lesson he had always known: power isn't just about making a big splash, it's about making sure your position is unshakable. And no matter how loud the world around him got, Paul knew that his quiet control would outlast the noise. The battle for control in the Gambino family had reached a new stage. Paul's quiet campaign to regain his influence was slowly beginning to show results. He had successfully reminded the family of the value of patience and stability, and the cracks in Gotti's fast-moving empire were starting to show. But Paul knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge would come when Gotti realized his position was no longer as secure as he had believed. As the weeks passed, Gotti's growing influence in the streets began to face some challenges. The excitement of his rapid rise had started to die down, and more people were questioning the sustainability of his approach. Gotti was a man of action, a man who thrived on the chaos and the adrenaline of the streets. But Paul knew that the streets could be fickle, and that constant risk-taking often led to instability. Paul's influence within the family was growing again, though it was still fragile. The younger generation, still drawn to Gotti's energy, wasn't ready to abandon him just yet. They wanted to be part of something exciting, something that promised instant rewards. Paul's quiet, methodical way of doing things still seemed foreign to them. But Paul was patient, and he knew that in time, the family would see that his vision was the one that would ensure their long-term success. One day, Paul sat down with a few of his most trusted advisors. They had been loyal to him through thick and thin, and he knew they were the key to stabilizing the family's operations. He needed their support, especially now, when the family was still divided and unsure of the future. He spoke to them about the importance of loyalty, about the need to maintain control over the businesses and resources that had always kept the family strong. It wasn't about the street-level hustle, it was about sustaining the empire that Paul had built over the years. But as he spoke, he could sense the growing uncertainty in the room. The younger men were still listening, but their eyes were fixed on the excitement of Gotti's rise. Paul knew that he had to act quickly if he wanted to secure their loyalty. He wasn't going to start a war with Gotti, but he needed to ensure that the family remembered why he was the one who had brought them success in the first place. Paul's next move was subtle but powerful. He began to reassert control over the family's legitimate businesses, the trucking companies, the construction projects, and the unions. He worked behind the scenes to ensure that the money kept flowing smoothly, that the deals were still being made, and that the family's operations remained profitable. The younger generation might have been distracted by Gotti's antics, but Paul knew that the true source of their power lay in the steady flow of money that came from these legitimate operations. And as long as that remained intact, Paul would continue to hold the reins. But even as Paul worked to stabilize his position, he knew that Gotti was not going to back down without a fight. The younger men in the family were growing impatient, and their loyalty to Paul was starting to waver. Gotti's bold moves had captured their attention, and he was becoming more and more difficult to ignore. Paul had to act fast if he wanted to regain full control. One evening, as Paul sat in his office once again, he received a phone call that would change everything. It was from one of his trusted men, who had been monitoring Gotti's movements in the streets. The message was clear: Gotti was about to make his move. The younger soldiers were rallying behind him, and Paul's influence in the streets was about to be challenged head-on. Paul's first instinct was to remain calm, to think strategically. He had known that Gotti's rise was inevitable, but he wasn't going to let the family fall apart without a fight. He took a deep breath and reminded himself of his strength, patience, loyalty, and the control he had over the family's operations. Gotti might have the streets, but Paul still had the power of the businesses and the resources that ran beneath the surface. It was time for Paul to make his next move. He couldn't let Gotti take control of the family without challenging it. But Paul wasn't about to start a violent confrontation. He knew better than to throw the family into chaos. Instead, he would do what he had always done best: work in the shadows, carefully shifting the pieces in his favor, quietly strengthening his position until Gotti's rise became his downfall. Paul wasn't going to let Gotti take the family. He had spent too many years building it, too many years building relationships, earning loyalty, and securing resources. The younger generation might have been eager for change, but Paul knew that the real power was in control. And he would not let that go easily. As the city hummed below him, Paul Castellano stood at a crossroads. He knew that his time was running out to reclaim the family's future. Gotti had made his move, and the battle for control had begun. But Paul had one thing Gotti didn't: time. The slow, steady hand of patience was still in his favor. And though the younger generation might crave the excitement of Gotti's rise, Paul knew that the foundation he had built over decades was unshakable. The future was still his to shape. The tension in the family had never been more palpable. Gotti's rise was no longer a whisper on the streets, it was a loud declaration of power. He had captured the attention of the younger soldiers, the ones who had once respected Paul's methodical approach but were now eager for the excitement and quick rewards that Gotti promised. Gotti had become the symbol of the future, a future full of risk, reward, and visible triumph. And Paul? He was becoming more and more of an afterthought, his steady, quiet leadership now overshadowed by Gotti's noise and charisma. But Paul had one advantage that Gotti didn't: control. Gotti had the streets, but Paul still controlled the operations, the businesses, and the flow of money that kept the family running. The family was divided, no doubt, but Paul wasn't ready to let go of everything he had built. He had worked too hard to let his empire slip away just because the younger generation was caught up in the excitement of Gotti's reign. Paul wasn't going to fight Gotti with violence or bravado. He was going to fight with what had always worked for him: patience, strategy, and the ability to control the undercurrents of power. The decision to act came one night when Paul sat in his office, reflecting on how quickly everything had changed. The younger men, once loyal to him, were now more interested in Gotti's promises of power and quick returns. The streets, with their constant pulse of energy, were calling to them, while Paul, the architect of their success, was seen as too slow, too cautious. But Paul had never been one to react impulsively. The family had survived because of his careful planning, not because of sudden bursts of energy. And as much as the world around him changed, Paul knew that the foundation of what he had built, the family's businesses, its resources, and its relationships, was still intact. It was time to remind the family of that. Paul had been working in the shadows, quietly tightening his grip on the family's legitimate businesses, ensuring the flow of money remained steady. He wasn't just going to let Gotti's rise shake the family to its core. He had spent too many years building an empire from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let that fall apart because of a loud, flashy rise. He knew that true power wasn't in making noise, it was in making sure that everything beneath the surface stayed strong. But Paul also knew that the time for subtlety was running out. He could no longer afford to be the quiet man in the background. The younger soldiers needed to be reminded of why they had followed him in the first place. They needed to see that his steady hand, his methodical approach to business, was what had kept the family afloat. They needed to remember the long game, the one Paul had always played. Paul reached out to a few of his most trusted men, those who had been with him from the beginning, those who understood the value of what he had built. Together, they began to strategize a way to bring the family back into alignment. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Gotti had captured the streets, but Paul still controlled the family's core. It was time to turn that core into a symbol of the family's strength. They started with the businesses. Paul knew that the family's power didn't just come from the streets, it came from the industries they controlled. The unions, the trucking routes, the construction projects, these were the lifeblood of the family. Gotti could make waves on the streets, but Paul had built an empire that couldn't be easily toppled. The key was to remind the family of that power, to show them that it was Paul who had created this empire, and it was Paul who still had the power to keep it running smoothly. At the same time, Paul began to slowly reassert his authority within the family. He met with key men, reminding them of their loyalty, of the values they had built their success on. He didn't need to convince them with grand speeches or flashy displays of power. He needed to remind them of what they had built together. He needed to make them see that the quick gains Gotti offered couldn't match the stability that Paul's leadership provided. But even as Paul worked to regain control, he knew that the situation was delicate. Gotti wasn't going to sit back and let Paul reclaim his power. The younger generation was still drawn to Gotti's boldness, and Gotti's influence was undeniable. But Paul had something Gotti didn't: time. Paul had spent years building a foundation that couldn't be easily destroyed. Gotti's rise had been fast, but it was also fragile. And Paul knew that all it would take was one wrong move, one misstep, and Gotti's empire would begin to unravel. The family was at a crossroads, and Paul knew that the coming weeks would determine whether he could hold on to his position or if the younger generation would fully turn to Gotti. But Paul wasn't afraid of change. He had seen the family through difficult times before. He had seen men rise and fall, and he had always managed to stay standing. This time would be no different. He would outlast the noise. He would show them all that the quiet power he had built was the only thing that could keep the family together. But even as Paul made his moves, he knew that Gotti wasn't finished. The real battle was still ahead. And Paul, ever the strategist, was ready. He had the patience, the resources, and the loyalty of those who still believed in him. The question now was, could he convince the rest of the family before it was too late? The final days of Paul Castellano's reign were marked by an unsettling quiet. The war for control within the Gambino family had reached a critical point, and everything he had worked for, the loyalty, the steady flow of money, the deep ties to New York's legitimate businesses, was now on the line. Gotti, with his brash charisma and fast-track rise, had captured the streets. His influence over the younger generation was undeniable. They were drawn to his raw energy, the promise of fast money, and the thrill of living on the edge. But Paul wasn't like them. He had never been someone who played for immediate rewards. His power was built on years of patience, careful calculation, and a deep understanding of what truly kept the family running: stability. He had built the Gambino Empire not with flashy gestures, but with a steady hand, a deep network of alliances, and a commitment to long-term success. But now, Gotti's chaotic rise had threatened that very foundation. The younger generation was eager for the rush of street dominance, and they were beginning to question whether Paul's approach still had a place in their future. Paul knew that the battle for control couldn't be won with noise. It couldn't be won by showing strength on the streets or making grandiose gestures. The key to his survival lay in the quiet, in the things Gotti's followers didn't see. Paul had something Gotti didn't: control over the family's legitimate businesses, its finances, and its deep connections across the city. These were the things that kept the family strong and ensured that they had resources far beyond the noise of street-level hustles. Paul's strategy had been simple: outlast the noise. He began to quietly secure his hold over the businesses and unions that were the true backbone of the family's wealth. Gotti might have been the face of the younger generation's ambitions, but Paul had built the foundation that kept the family thriving. He wasn't going to let that slip away without a fight. The younger men needed to see that Gotti's rise, though thrilling, was based on instability, on momentary gains, not long-term control. Weeks went by, and Paul worked diligently in the background. He spoke with the old guard, with those who had stood by him for years, reminding them of their shared history, of the family's legacy. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. The younger soldiers, those who had been seduced by the excitement of Gotti's rise, started to question whether the chaos Gotti embraced could truly sustain the family. They wanted results, yes, but they also wanted security, stability, and a future. Gotti, meanwhile, continued to draw attention, making bold moves that further cemented his place as the leader of the streets. But Paul knew that the more visible Gotti became, the more vulnerable he was. The streets could be ruthless, and the attention that Gotti had garnered could quickly turn against him. Power built on excitement often came at a high price, and Paul was willing to wait for that price to show itself. Then, the moment came. It wasn't a dramatic showdown, but a quiet shift. Gotti's most trusted lieutenants began to see cracks in his reign. The street-level excitement had begun to fade, and with it, the loyalty of some of the men who had once followed him so eagerly. As Paul had predicted, Gotti's loud, fast-paced rise wasn't built to last. The foundation that Paul had so carefully constructed remained steady, and as the younger men began to see the long-term benefits of stability, they started to question whether Gotti's path was the one they wanted to follow. In one final move, Paul gathered his most loyal men and made his presence known. He didn't need to confront Gotti head-on, nor did he need to make a spectacle of himself. The family was watching, and it was clear that Paul still commanded respect. He reminded them of what had made the Gambino family great: loyalty, control, and the ability to outlast any storm. And as Paul's men, those who had seen the family rise to its peak, started to rally behind him again, Gotti's influence began to wane. The fight for control had not been won by violence or force, it had been won by patience and subtlety. Paul's legacy was not about making the loudest moves, it was about knowing when to act, when to wait, and how to maintain control over the things that truly mattered. Gotti's rise had been quick and thrilling, but it was the quiet, calculated strength of Paul Castellano that had endured. In the end, the family saw what Paul had always known: the foundation of their power lay not in the excitement of the streets but in the businesses, relationships, and steady influence Paul had built. Gotti's time at the top had been fleeting, And as Paul regained control of the family, he reminded them all of one thing: true power wasn't in the loudest voice, it was in the quiet hand that guided everything from the shadows. Paul Castellano had outlasted the noise. And as he looked out over the city one last time, he knew that the Gambino family, under his steady hand, would continue to endure for years to come. If you've enjoyed following Paul's journey, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. What did you think of the way Paul regained control? Let us know your thoughts on the story.